Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Tensions between Pakistan and India are at an all-time high following India's aggressive act of targeting and attacking what it alleged was a terrorist training camp in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. It was a blatant act, and details have made clear that India's accusation was totally false. The claim to have destroyed the infrastructure and killed 350 terrorists has become a laugh, as also reported by the international media. That said, India's surreptitious act was and is an act of war. The statement put out by India's Foreign Secretary used the word preemption, implying self-defense. We will, of course, discuss that and its implications. However, India's act forced Pakistan to retaliate, choosing and locking in 6 targets on the Indian side and then hitting open areas close by to signal to India both the capability and the resolve to use it. Immediately after Pakistan's aerial action, the Indian Air Force tried to ingress into Azad Kashmir airspace. The PF shot down 2 Indian aircraft and captured one of the pilots, who bailed out after the hit. The pilot, Wing Commander Abhinandan, is in Pakistan's custody. Meanwhile, the escalation follows an act of armed resistance by a local Kashmiri boy who killed 44 Central Reserve Police Force personnel in occupied Kashmir. India immediately accused Pakistan to steer the issue away from its oppression of Kashmiris to terrorism. After failing in the 2 military rounds to achieve anything, it is now likely to press the matter diplomatically. This is where Pakistan needs to be very careful given India's heft. Our diplomatic efforts must be focused on ensuring that India cannot make this about terrorism, and that Kashmir and Kashmiris' right to self-determination is not lost in the din of what's currently happening. Our menu is full today, and we have with us Lt.Gen. Waheed Arshad, former Chief of General Staff of Pakistan Army, Ali Sultan, an international law expert who also teaches at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, Ambassador Ghalib Iqbal, a former career Foreign Service officer, Air Commodore Khalid Banuri, former Arms Control Disarmament Agency at the Strategic Plans Division. We are also joined by Syed Babar Qadri, an advocate in Srinagar, and Gowhar Geelani, who is a journalist also from Srinagar. But before I get down to this discussion, there's one thing which is extremely important, and this is also with reference to Prime Minister Imran Khan's speech, to earlier speeches, and his policy statement in the National Assembly, where he referred to the Pulwama attack as a terrorist act. I think that we need to be very careful about the language that we use, because the boy who attacked the convoy hit a military target. He was a local Kashmiri boy. His attack was justified under several instruments of international law and accepted definitions of who can be targeted and how. If we accept India's line with reference to Masood Azhar, we accept that the boy was a terrorist. That will have terrible repercussions for the struggle in Indian-occupied Kashmir. We would also accept, and that's even worse, that India was justified in its preemption, and a number of other issues that we will discuss in the course of this discussion. But I wanted to put these points on the table very clearly, because, as I said, and I repeat, and that language and the words that we use are very important. General Arshad, just give us a sense of how you view the situation, their action, our retaliation, and of course our retaliation through a standoff capability, which means that we did not cross any line, and the decision to lock in the targets but not really destroy them, and then of course an act of self-defense, shooting down the 2 Indian aircraft.
I think it was something which was coming, and the government of Pakistan already announced that they will retaliate if the Indians undertake any aggressive action, and they did. And they crossed over the line of control and also violated Pakistan's airspace, not only the space of Azad Kashmir, but
also
Pakistan's airspace, and it can be taken as an act of war. That they didn't hit anything and just exited without doing anything says a lot.
Does not really matter.
Yes,
because that act of war.
The fact remains that they aggressed, and whether they hit or not is not an issue at all. I mean, it's they could have done it if they were more professional about it, but they didn't, and they couldn't. Obviously, Pakistan retaliated. So now here we have a situation where India committed an act of aggression. It was retaliated as per policy by Pakistan. So the ball is now squarely in Indian court.
Let me ask you another thing, because when you were the CGS, I remember Pakistan was validating certain doctrine, especially in relation to collaborative action by the Pakistan Army and the Pakistan Air Force. You had those exercises, Azmino 1, 2, 3. I recall with exercises High Mark. Is that now the way to go about it, where the two services are in better operational coordination?
Yes, I think both the services have excellent coordination and integration in terms of operational concepts, in terms of practically practicing those concepts in operation area. We started off in FATA, SWAT in fact, and continued in FATA, and both the services have now sort of matured their operational concepts in terms of by-service cooperation in any operational scenario. And the one we saw being undertaken by the Pakistan Air Force by shooting down these two aircrafts is part of that overall operational strategy which is being followed by both the services. I think it is excellent coordination. And you mentioned that they locked on the targets and they didn't hit the targets. Was an act of maturity. I think it's because we didn't want to escalate as per our policy. We could have easily taken out those targets. We were legally allowed to do that. I mean, we were attacked, but we didn't do that. To give a message that we don't want to escalate. We have the capability, but we don't want to escalate. And if the Indians had not crossed the line of control following that, strike, they wouldn't have been shot down.
Correct.
So I think the Indians have two very clear strategic options here on. I mean, the first is they should de-escalate. If some sense prevails, I think they placated their domestic audience to some extent by carrying out that ingress and then exiting. And
but the problem is that their prime ministers ended up with a lot of egg on his face.
I mean, problem is that the Indians actually miscalculated hugely.
Yeah.
And if you remember our post-2016 Uri issue, when they had made a huge issue out of this so-called surgical strike, which is actually a fire raid, and they made fake videos and even their own media took them to task.
Correct.
Now they thought that it was a new normal.
Yes.
And they wanted to continue with it. And they didn't realize that Pakistan will do everything to make sure that it does not become a new normal.
Correct.
So Pakistan had to retaliate. I mean, this is the miscalculation which they thought the Pakistan will not.
So after that September 2016 so-called surgical strike, they thought that they could repeat that and actually go up on the ladder. Whereas for Pakistan, it was essential to ensure that that does not happen and that does not become the new normal. But let me pull in Air Commodore Khalid Banuri here. Air Commodore Banuri, this is with the nuclear weapons. So we're talking about a nuclear dyad here. With the nuclear weapons, and we also know that the Indians have been trying to find some space just below that threshold in order to exercise conventional options. Now, in terms of the miscalculation that General Arshad is talking about, do you think that they hugely miscalculated for some reason, the Pakistani military's capability, because there are certain asymmetries, but those asymmetries are also covered by the fact that right now, as we speak, India does not really have a huge march on the Pakistani military in terms of technical capabilities. Would you agree with that?
I would want to start with saying that if this was a miscalculation, hoping that Pakistan will not respond, this was clearly a miscalculation. Hope is not a strategy, and this is how it has evolved. It's a four-letter word. And I tend to agree with your absolutely. But I tend to agree with you when you say that 2016 they thought they could go up one rung up on this one and hoping to get away with this. But what they have done by going a rung up is to have attacked Pakistani territory. That is clearly an act of war. It's use of force within international law, which is very clear on a violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter that clearly identifies that territorial integrity of a state is violated. That is where the reaction had to come. So hoping that Pakistan will do nothing was a fallacy that happened on the Indian side.
So let's game it. General Arshad was saying that one option that they have is to de-escalate, especially if better sense prevails. But we also know that the very reason this thing has happened, and this is quite apart from, of course, the fact that Modi is looking at an incoming, upcoming election, he also kind of locked himself into a commitment trap by, essentially metaphorically talking about his 56-inch chest and the rest of it. So there is, and now after these two rounds, with a lot of egg on his face, do you think there is a real possibility that he would go for de-escalation, or is he likely to go further up on the escalation ladder?
The main reaction that one can have to this issue is that even if a country decides to use force, it is expected to be on, assumably, the rational actor model. But here, the rationality of this decision maker in India is, in my view, a clear question mark in what he wants to achieve. So it's a bit iffy. The second point is, whenever there's an escalation, even an aggressor, in this case clearly India, cannot ensure that further escalation will not happen. And that's precisely what the Pakistani Prime Minister said. The moment the reprisal had happened, he turned around and said, it won't be controllable because, the tit for tat or those kind of, the impetus for doing more or restoring or doing something in counter will tend to kick in, and that is what we should not be doing. So I think this is where the leadership behavior in the sense of rationality comes in.
Okay. I'm also joined on the phone by former Air Chief Marshal, Air Marshal Sohail Aman. Air Marshal Aman, thank you so much for your time. We just want to know, given that Pakistan Air Force is the primary force that has so far been involved in, interdicting also and in operations against the Indian Air Force. As a former Air Chief, how do you look at the performance so far, and how would you rate, expect the Indian Air Force to respond if this escalates?
Okay, thank you very much. The performance of the Air Force traditionally, like the way it has been, whether it was the 65-71 wars or more recently, the operations against the terrorists in the FATA area, they've done a splendid job. I think they've always been in the front foot, and the reason for doing all this has been excellent training that we carry out. And when we do this training, we always train against an Air Force which is far superior both in technology and numbers. So I think what the boys have done, I'm very glad, I'm very satisfied. The way they have performed, they've done an operation which is precise, which is absolutely professional, and within one go they have shown their offensive and defensive capability as a demonstration. And honestly speaking, this is one of the simplest operations that our pilots have undertaken yesterday. The Air Force is prepared far beyond any other challenge.
So does this also tell us something about the capability of JF-17? Because apparently it was a JF-17 being piloted by a squadron leader that made the hit. And that also makes history, because I think this is the first ever hit by a JF-17.
Not really. The 2 points that I would like to make. First of all, we must not discuss which aeroplane was it, because let that be a surprise for the Indian Air Force, that which aircraft was it. Okay. Let me tell you that starting from the F-16 to the JF-17s and to our other aeroplanes, we have upgraded all our aircraft with superior weaponry. So I would not like to divulge here, but that if you recall, it's about 1.5 years before that on the western border, an Iranian UAV moved into our airspace, and our JF-17 in the middle of the night went and shot. So the basic point here is that we are, mashallah, flying more than 100 aircraft, the JF-17, and in many domains they exceed the F-16 aeroplane. So I think we are very proud and we are very, very satisfied with this indigenously produced aircraft. It is living up to the expectations. And what we have put in this aeroplane is a lot of indigenous equipment, and we are very proud that this is delivering.
Okay, great. One final question. Some of, the first night or early morning when they came in, and there's a bit of confusion about whether they struck, through a standoff, in a standoff mode, or whether they actually came in to some extent. There were questions being asked about the preparedness of the Pakistan Air Force, and some people were also questioning about the air defense and the fact that why couldn't some of those, aircraft be shot down. Would you like to explain technically how and why that might not have happened?
All right. It's very simple to understand. In my point of view, Air Force in both the days performed extremely well, exceedingly well. Getting into the enemy territory by 2-3 miles at a very fast speed and coming out is not something super that any Air Force can do.
Okay.
It is doable. Fact is that our aeroplanes were still in there to challenge them, and that is why they abandoned their mission. They went back, and they could strike nothing important, and that has been proved. So I think Air Force did exceedingly well in both the days.
Okay, thank you so much. That was former Air Chief Admiral Sohail Aman. Ali Sultan, technical point, starting with the use of the term preemption in the statement that was issued by the Indian Foreign Secretary. Interestingly enough, before the program, you were also mentioning this independent piece by Robert Fisk, which has a very interesting caption, and it says, Israel's fingerprints are all over India's escalating conflict with Pakistan. And I was reading through the piece, and it said that, the entire language has the Israeli footprint on it.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Ejaz. And before I answer your question, let me just say that I sincerely and solemnly hope that sanity does prevail and two sides de-escalate, because the risks here
that India de-escalates, because we are not escalating
that India
at all.
de-escalates and India accepts the olive branch that we have been extending to them variously, and even now. So to answer your question, Ejaz, the word preemption is very problematic in international law. This was basically developed by Israel in order to give a legal cover to its counterterrorism operations, in occupied territories, and also that it was borrowed by the neoconservatives in the Bush administration in order to give a legal cover to the global war on terror.
But they also conflated a preventive war with preemption,
right,
which is a greater moral hazard.
Absolutely.
And the Israelis also used this against the Iraqi nuclear reactor.
Yeah, so it has ended up being a very confusing and a complicated sort of a cocktail, which is very problematic from the standpoint of a traditional understanding of the law on use of force, where the idea is to exercise force as a last resort option. And there are only two recognized options. One is under the permission of the Security Council, and the other is in self-defense. Now, preemptive Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Now, if force is used except these exceptions, in addition, outside of these exceptions, then what that amounts to, and India has done that precisely in the incursion, because that was unlawful. It was a reprisal. That's the correct word to describe it. That use of force was a reprisal. So by doing so, India has actually violated Article 2, Paragraph 4, territorial integrity and sovereignty of Pakistan. But what that actually translates to is that they have committed an international wrong against the state of Pakistan, and they've committed international crime against peace.
But aren't they by invoking preemption, and I completely agree with you that it's a very problematic concept, but by invoking preemption, they have also tried to rely, extending it or extrapolating it from it, Article 51 in terms of self-defense.
Right, but Article 51, the textual interpretation which has been put forward by the ICJ, by many other authorities, the traditional viewpoint, the classical viewpoint, rejects the preemptive, the sort of preemptive self-defense under Article 51. Again, you have to understand that when the UN Charter was drafted, the idea was to progressively cabin the use of force rather than extend it, over time. So if we try extending this preemptive doctrine, which, as I said, was really developed more specifically in the context of the global war on terror. And the US made this point that they face exceptional threats. Now, with all due respect, now that may have some minority acceptance. There is some minority acceptance to this US viewpoint, but India, with all due respect, is not the US. So for states to be given this right of preemption would mean that they would become the judge, the jury, the executioner in these situations. And then there would be a liberal use of force in the world, which is precisely what the United Nations was created to prevent.
Okay.
So it goes against the fundamental purposes, the bedrock principles on which the global security architecture has been structured in the post-World War II.
Okay, I have other questions also, but let me just cross over to occupied Kashmir, to Srinagar, before I take a break. Gowhar Geelani is with us, who's a journalist. Gowhar Geelani, give us a sense of what the atmosphere there is.
Mr. Ejaz, as of now, there is a demand in Kashmir. What is happening between India and Pakistan is one aspect of it, and what's happening behind the back doors, international communities interference, and the role of mediation played by countries like US, Saudi Arabia, and the rest. But there's a demand that in between this India and Pakistan story, somehow the Kashmir story is lost. Absolutely. And that Kashmir story is, for example, when Mr. Farooq Dar, a civilian, was tied to the bonnet of an army jeep by a disgraced Indian Major Gogoi, and then no UN, Geneva Convention was invoked, when even kids were hit by the pellets, and even the mortar remains of Afzal Guru and Muhammad Maqbool Butt are not being handed over to the families. So no UN charter or Geneva Convention was invoked, and even the United Nations resolutions are disrespected day in and day out. And in last week, more than 200 people have been arrested in nocturnal raids across Kashmir, and mostly they are political prisoners or socio-religious leaders. So this Delhi has kind of punished the population of Jammu and Kashmir because what is happening at the LOC or the international border. It's a fact that India violated sovereignty of Pakistan, because not only it crossed over the LOC, but it also hit Balakot. Whatever the damage was done, there was no evidence whether it was a successful raid or not. But once Pakistan did the same, so now UN Geneva conventions are being invoked. Even a statesmanly gesture from Imran Khan to announce that Mr. Abhinandan will be released tomorrow as a peace gesture. This is shown on Indian television as a weakness, as if that under international pressure, Pakistan has been forced to do such an act. But from a Kashmiri perspective, Imran Khan has won this round, and it is being appreciated as a moral victory for Pakistan and Imran Khan, and his statesmanship is being appreciated. But at the same time, there's a question mark on Pakistan also, that why Kashmiris who are languishing in Indian jails, and why Kashmiris are being punished, and why Kashmir story is lost in all this bigger story.
I completely agree with you. I think the Kashmir story should not be lost. And on this note, I'll quickly go to Ambassador Ghalib Iqbal before I take a break. Ambassador Iqbal, as I mentioned in introduction also, and I've been saying this in my writings also, that unfortunately one of the things that India has been able to do rather successfully is to push the real central issue of Kashmir, the right to self-determination, on the back burner, and turn it into an issue of terrorism and a problem between India and Pakistan. Now, you, having been a career diplomat, can you give us a sense of why we have not really been able to ensure that the central point does not get lost in all this brouhaha?
We need to understand what's happening within India. The silent majority, the educated class over India, they have started questioning the motives of Mr. Modi. Mr. Modi started the whole tussle on the basis of getting extra votes for him for the coming elections. Unfortunately, it backfired. They pointed the fingers towards Pakistan after what happened in Indian-held Kashmir and the death of the 44 security officials. But after that, they kept on escalating it. Now we are at a situation where we are talking about de-escalation. Prime Minister Imran Khan, in his 2 speeches, I'm not going to talk about the third one, which he just delivered at the Parliament.
National Assembly. Yeah.
I'm going to talk about 2 previous speeches. Because of this, I think he earned a lot of fans and people who actually start thinking about what's happening in Kashmir. Indians are also oblivious of the fact that the truth in Kashmir is that there is oppression going on, and India is doing it, especially for the last 4 years.
I'm going to take a short break here, and at the other end of the break, we'll continue with this discussion. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing the India-Pakistan tension and the fact that India aggressed against Pakistan and Pakistan retaliated, remaining within its right of self-defense as enshrined in and articulated by Article 51 of the UN Charter. But before I took the break, and also in my introduction, I said this, and I repeat it, that the real issue gets lost, and the real issue is about Kashmir and Kashmiris' right to self-determination. So let me go back to Ambassador Ghalib Iqbal on this and get his views on why we have not really been successful in dominating the narrative here.
I think it will be wrong to say that we have not been able to get the attention of the world. We have been. The world understands. The world realizes that Kashmir is a dispute which can turn into a very ugly war. The international community, especially the Western world, understands it fully. But the problem is
no,
that
but when
India
you say no, but Ambassador Iqbal, when you say Kashmir is a dispute, is this a dispute in terms of a dispute between India and Pakistan over real estate? Or is this a dispute because India oppresses the Kashmiris and denies them their basic inalienable right, a peremptory norm called the right to self-determination? We need to be very clear about this.
When I say it's a dispute, that means that India has not been able to give the right of self-determination to the Kashmiris, which was promised to them under the UN resolutions. Pakistan has a position on that. India has a position on that. We understand that whatever is happening in Kashmir is actually a freedom struggle. Pakistan has been able to bring the attention
then why
of the
are we
global
so then why
community
are
on
we
this very
referring to
sensitive
the
issue.
Pulwama so then why are we referring to the Pulwama attack, which was an attack against a military target, as a terrorist attack? Why are we using this term?
Because even under the international laws, if the military has been targeted by the freedom fighters of an area, it's not a terrorist attack.
Precisely.
It is a struggle towards getting their freedom. It's a struggle towards getting what they want to achieve through the UN resolutions.
So then we at the highest level. Anyway, let me go to Syed Babar Qadri here, who's an advocate and is in Srinagar. Babar Qadri, give me a sense of, I'm talking about language, and I'm talking about narrative, and I'm talking about the fact that the narrative and the language are extremely important, nay, crucial to legal instruments. If we begin to talk about the Pulwama attack as a terrorist attack, then we're actually talking about the Indian narrative, and we're squarely playing into the Indian hands. Would you agree with me?
First, I thank you for inviting me on this, debate. Secondly, the prime thing should be that before reaching to any permanent conclusion, this was attacked by Kashmiris or Kashmiri groups. Let India investigate the entire incident first. Before investigations are concluded, they have leveled allegations against Kashmiri boy, whom we don't know where he is, whether he was actually involved in it or not. See, sir, why I'm saying so? To get arrange 200, 300, 400 kgs of explosive device within the valley is very much impossible under the present circumstances. So, who provided this quantity of explosive, material is very much, questionable. One. Second, since 2 years, as I regularly, along with my brother, this Gowhar Geelani sahab, we appear on Indian TVs, and since 2 years, I have been crying on Indian TV that, see, your Modi ji is not delivering the promises that he had made before 2014 elections. He has engaged with, lynching minorities, mandir construction, Ram Mandir construction, demolition of Babri Masjid case. He has been, instead of developing the state, crushing the minorities.
Babar Qadri, let me stop you there. Frankly, I'm not really interested in what Modi has or has not been able to achieve as far as India is concerned. That's his headache. I am also not concerned about India. I'm not concerned about insurgencies in the northeast. I'm not concerned about the Naxalites, the huge red corridor. What I'm concerned about simply is occupied Kashmir and Kashmiris' right to self-determination. What India does, how it oppresses people in the northeast, what it does with the Naxalites, whether Modi has been able to deliver on jobs or the rest of it, that's not my concern at all. It's their headache. It's India's internal matter. So my question to you is that if we begin to look at Kashmiris' armed resistance as terrorism, then we're playing into India's narrative.
See, let me say you honestly that I doubt the very credentials of this attack. I think it has been done by Mr. Doval so as to justify what Modi is planning to promote himself.
So
yes,
you're
it's
saying
a false flag, and I doubt this. I don't agree with the narrative of India.
Okay, stay with me on this. General Arshad, it's a false flag. People in India have also been saying this, incidentally. In fact, what they're saying is that they perhaps did have the information, but they let the attack happen. Now, as Babar Qadri is saying, that kind of explosive, and even explosive, the information regarding the explosive has been conflicting. Now they're talking about RDX and all of that. Then rigging the vehicle with that and all of that, that kind of expertise or whatever. How much do you think would there be a possibility of a false flag?
I mean, false flags have been happening. I mean,
yes.
in Kashmir, and we are all aware of the incidents which have taken place. It is important to understand that, as he was saying, and you also saying, that kind of explosives being and then rigged into a vehicle-borne IED, and then that vehicle being allowed to go on a sanitized road. When there is a large convoy moving, the road is sanitized.
Correct.
Nobody was moving on that road. So there is this single vehicle coming on the road, which is already sanitized, protected. I mean, raises a lot of questions. And that is why I think government of Pakistan has been very clearly, they have said that let's investigate. I mean, it can only, after investigation, one can be sure who has done that. Because as he is saying, that boy was already in Indian custody. There are reports in Indian media that the boy was already in Indian custody. So where did he come from? And so, I mean, unless you investigate, only then one can find out whether it was an act of reprisal by a Kashmiri against the atrocities being committed by the Indian army there, or was it a Jaish-led, planned attack, or was it a false flag? Unless there are investigations, and that is why I think the position of the government is very clear on that.
So Prime Minister Imran Khan has said that India has given a dossier. Now we don't know what the contents of that dossier is, but he said that the government of Pakistan will look into this.
Yes, of course they should.
But Ali Sultan, give me a sense under international law of the stress that I'm putting on language and the terms that we use. Am I being paranoid about it, or whether I'm saying something which is genuine?
Well, Ejaz, I think the taxonomy is absolutely critical in international law. So your foreign policy should conform to the text, to the right phrases within international law. And in the context of Kashmir, now, if we call it occupied Kashmir, that has an absolutely different legal framework attached to it, as opposed to calling it Indian-held Kashmir, Indian-administered Kashmir. Because once you classify that situation as an occupation, which you can under the framework of the Geneva Conventions 4, that's when the Geneva Conventions will start, will be triggered in that situation. And India's own internal constitutional arrangement lends some truth to this, because the Article 370, which for now,
which has been diluted to a very large extent.
Yes, but which incorporates Kashmir, with India for now.
But gives Kashmir a special status.
Exactly, right? But it's included under temporary and transient provisions of the Indian Constitution. So the Indians themselves accept that this is a transient sort of a phase in Kashmir, and that it is actually a dispute which should be solved under the UN General Assembly resolutions, because the Kashmiris' right of self-determination still has not been exercised as per a colonial oppression. So that right is still outstanding. And until that is exercised, and if we do portray this as an occupation, then the argument that this attack is not terrorism but an act which is perhaps arguably allowed under the Geneva Conventions, because the target was a legitimate military target. He didn't target any civilians, in the Pulwama attack. So yes, the taxonomy, the phrases are extremely important, and we should use them very carefully. And with a lot of...
So you would agree with me that when at the highest level, and I'm talking about the language used by the Prime Minister, that the reference to terrorism is something that we should not have talked about.
Yes, I think the language could have been been better. It probably should have been vetted by an international lawyer, before he made this statement. That would have been ideal, but I don't know whether it was vetted or not. So yes, this conflation of terrorism with the freedom struggle in Kashmir is actually what India has been pushing at the global level, which is why they've been asking for the last 2 years. The Indian Minister of External Affairs, Sushma Swaraj, has spent substantial chunks of his speech at the UN General Assembly, the annual speech at the UN General Assembly, dedicating time advocating for a comprehensive convention on international terrorism. And the whole idea behind that convention is to vitiate this distinction. So in a sense, but so far, that convention has not been adopted by the global community, because there is no unanimity on a universal definition of terrorism. So that's the entire framework within which this statement needs to be analyzed.
Absolutely. Vitiate is a very, very good word that you've used. Let me go back to Air Commodore Banuri. Air Commodore Banuri, tell us, because questions have also been asked about the issue of deterrence here. And one of the central points about deterrence, or at least to the extent in which it has been debated here in Pakistan, is that given our nuclear capability, nuclear weapons capability, that there's absolutely no chance of a conventional conflict. Now, people are saying that India has tried to find that space. How would you analyze this? Would you argue saying that, yes, this kind of action can dilute deterrence? Or are you going to argue that the very fact that India cannot escalate is reason enough for us to be confident that deterrence will hold or has held?
Okay, I'm really tempted to go back to your previous part of the discussion, but let me come to that in a minute, because I think I can contribute to that question as well. But let me first respond to your this issue of how does deterrence work. Once hostilities start to happen, when military operations start to kick in, deterrence gets nudged, but deterrence hasn't failed. Nuclear weapons are seen as the last resort, and they are not. There hasn't been any significant or any specific signaling about that. So I don't see that thing, although the danger of where would the escalation eventually go will always remain there. So, that's the nervy side on which the Pakistani Prime Minister also turns around and says, stop at this, reprisal has happened, and that's when he said, give peace a chance. What am I really saying? What I am saying is deterrence gets a bit fragile when these kind of operations happen, but a balance has to be restored, and that I do not see this kind of getting in a very, very aggressively compromising situation. But Ejaz, if you permit me a minute or two, I want to go back to your original question of the terminologies and the stance that you asked about what the Indian narrative and Pakistani narrative on the broader issues of Kashmir is. And very quickly, and Dr. Ali Sultan has explained it beautifully about the sense of terminology, but let me just put some of those things in boxes. Kashmir 101. One, of course, is that this is not the terrorism the way it is defined. I think it is a phrase of language that several people, including some in Pakistan who write about this, have used, but that's not how it is. I think the reason why this is happening is there's a lot of concern in Azad Kashmir as well as in the IOK on the use of pellet guns, on the human rights atrocities. Now that all these are issues of international human rights law, which are largely seen as peacetime, etc., etc. Now, these issues that you refer to as the issue of what is actually happening in Kashmir and how India is behaving there, what India has done by taking these kind of operations in the day before yesterday is they have actually triggered it very clearly. This is an international armed conflict. An international armed conflict comes under international humanitarian law, and that is why several references to Geneva Conventions are being made. Now,
Ambassador Iqbal, any last thoughts in terms of India's diplomatic offensive and how Pakistan should preempt it or counter it?
I believe that what all has happened during the last 2 days, 3 days, we should not restrict our thought process to that. We need to think about the future. What is the ultimate objective of India? We need to keep Balochistan and what all Indians want to do in Balochistan in our minds. We need to be prepared for that, and we need to preempt that. And this is connected to that because a number of terminologies, as you have mentioned, could be used in our part of Balochistan. And it is important that we make a distinction between the terminologies, we make a distinction between the international law, we make a distinction between what is happening within our region, and never talk about going nuclear in any case.
Okay. General Arshad, I am not particularly keen on bringing in Balochistan into this because I think it's a false equivalence in the sense that Balochistan is not a disputed.
It's got nothing to do with this whole situation. I mean, it will be stupid to do that, really.
Yeah.
And they're totally different situations. And I think we shouldn't even talk about that. I mean, it's very clear that there is a freedom movement going on in Indian-occupied Kashmir. There are United Nations Security Council resolutions on an issue of unresolved issues since partition of India after British rule. I mean, it's not rocket science. Everybody understands that. So I think we should remain focused because it's important to tell the world that this, whatever is happening between India and Pakistan is because of Kashmir.
Absolutely.
And whatever is happening there in terms of oppression. I mean, that boy who blew himself up with the vehicle, howsoever he did it, the fact remains that it's an expression of anger by the population inside Indian-occupied Kashmir. I mean, the world needs to focus on that because that is going to lead to war between Pakistan and India.
Absolutely.
And Indians have aggressed by, and I think we shouldn't even call it an act of reprisal. If you call it an act of reprisal, it means that Pakistan has done that act.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's not even an act of reprisal, it's a clear act of aggression against Pakistan. And I think Pakistan has responded very maturely. They could have
professionally and with restraint.
They could have done much more. They didn't do that. And after releasing the pilot, even the Indians, even now, the Indians take the road of, the strategy of coercion by continuing to deploy their forces, sending the dossier, keep the forces deployed, use the international community to pressurize Pakistan to move on this dossier, whatever it has. I mean, they have this option available to them. Otherwise, I mean, if the sense prevails there, and I am told that there's a lot of opposition of building up to Prime Minister Modi's strategy.
Correct.
They hopefully they should be able to de-escalate while Pakistan continues to look at the dossier and whatever, because Pakistan has actually announced that we will, support you in whatever investigations.
Absolutely, but I think you very clearly, and I agree with you, laid out what India's possible strategy could be in terms of coercion also and the diplomatic offensive also and the rest of it. Thank you so much, Ali Sultan, General Waheed, Arshad, Gowhar Geelani, Syed, Babar, Qadri, Ambassador Ghalib Iqbal, and Air Commodore Khalid Banuri for being on the program and giving us your inputs. This is all for today from Indus Special. We'll see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.